One of the things I'd always thought about when I was at school is that I wanted to work with people and didn't just want to go to university and get a degree and then not quite know what to do with it. And we had friends, one of whom was a physiotherapist, and I think she said I might be a good physiotherapist. So we had to have interviews with the principal at that time, and so I came down for my interview, and I think I still have the handwritten reference from the family friend who suggested I could be a good physiotherapist. And I think we also had fingers inspected, and we were asked why we wanted to be in the school just by the one person, the principal, and then I was given the opportunity to come. So in those days we used to have the terms, and so we started really early in the year and we always finished much later than the rest of the university students, but we were enrolled part-time at the university, so it didn't make us different from the other students on campus, and we would have physics and the old-fashioned physics teaching lecture theatres in the middle of the Clock Tower campus, and we were able to join the Students' Association, and there would always be the physio law beach party and the physio med bash and things like that. So we were never seen as being a different group, even though it was hospital based and the hospital board was the giver of the certificate at the end. So we were students on campus, and obviously the students were able to live in the halls of residence as well, whereas students who were at the Polytechnic or the College of Education were more isolated than physiotherapy. It always traditionally remained in its university environment where it started off. Because the program was actually run by the hospital board, the School of Physiotherapy was also the physiotherapy department. So we had this wonderful big building with a full-size swimming pool, huge outpatient department, big gymnasium downstairs for patients to come into, and then we had the school classrooms upstairs. So the facilities were really good, even compared with many of the other schools overseas. I think that we had a huge facility which worked really well. It had a lot of the old-fashioned things still in it. It still had the douches so that you could have the hot and cold contrast baths, and it had a paediatric swimming pool for the paediatric department, and Pat Wood was a lecturer but also worked with the children, and I can remember big balls and things in the paediatric area, and people talk now about Swiss balls being the in thing, but in fact we always had them. It was never anything new for physiotherapy. And with the large swimming pool, which was well over my head at the deep end, we were able to do our hydrotherapy very much part and parcel with the treatments and the management of the patient. It was never a hassle to take them there because it was always on site. Upstairs we had a big gymnasium, which was where we had what they called class teaching, which these days would probably be kinesiology or kinesiology. It's changed its name so many times, but it was Swedish remedial massage and gym exercises and all the other things that we now think of as biomechanics and joint motion and all those sorts of things. But the facilities were excellent, I think, for teaching. We were very lucky in that, and again, because the hospital's in the middle of the campus, we didn't have far to walk to anatomy or physiology in the university departments. The first time that behavioural science was introduced into the program was when I was a student, and so that was a new line of teaching. And they always had medical house surgeons or registrars doing the anatomy teaching and the physiology teaching as well. There was sometimes the lecturers, but it was invariably for anatomy it was the senior medical students and house surgeons and registrars who actually taught us. And then when we had exams and vivas, it would be the surgeons who would come and grill us about neuroanatomy and those sorts of things. So I think we actually had a very strong foundation for our course. We had a large number of the medical staff who were involved in the teaching, pathology, and with all the concepts like women's health, orthopaedics. It was very much part and parcel of an integrated program where the medical staff would be involved in the teaching, and then the school staff would actually do the other components. And we had a number of characters on the staff who sort of came and went during the time that I was there. We had Mrs. Wordy, who became Mrs. Robertson, everybody was a little wary of her. She seemed to be such an awesome person, and we were a little bit scared of her, but in fact she's such a nice and understanding woman that I don't know why we were ever scared of her, but we were probably scared of most of the staff, I think. Billy McLeod seemed to be quite an awe-inspiring person as well. The class was divided into A to L and M to Z, so you hardly ever got to know the people in the A to L group, because they did classwork in the morning and we did classwork in the afternoon, and then we'd swap around. So we were very much confined to knowing and getting to know the people in the second half of the alphabet, for me anyway. And we even had different locker rooms. The A to L's had one room and the M to Z's had the other. And of course the few males that we had another room, but we lost all our males. After the first year, we had 3 who started and they all failed. So from year 2 to year 3, we had no males in our class, which was quite unusual, just the girls. And so it was very dominated by females, as far as I recall, in the profession. Not that there was ever any difficulty working with the guys, but they just didn't survive the program. So a lot of the content of the undergrad program was very forward-thinking, because people like Frank Whedon had manipulative physiotherapy skills, and we would learn peripheral manipulation from him and mobilisation. And that was still coming into some of the other programs in other countries, I think. Robbie Powell, who was a Scottish physiotherapist, had a brother who was also a physiotherapist. Robbie was, Jack had just left the school and had gone overseas when I started, but Robbie was the PNF teacher, and he was great with the PNF, and we all used to do it in a very physical way, and be arching the back and leaping off the bed basically as we were doing our PNF, but it was a great way to learn. And then Grace Wilson arrived in year 2, and she was very much into electrotherapy. That was one of the key things that she was teaching at that time. And again, having a new person who was another strong person from Britain was, if you ever had a teacher who'd come from Britain, I think we always used to think that was quite something. And so she was, again, quite an inspiring person. And I always remember that she examined me in electrotherapy in year 2, and I had this wound that I had to deal with the ultraviolet. I had the chromire, and I must have got a really good mark because I got the electrotherapy prize. Obviously I was quite good at wound management, or she seemed to think that I was, but I know that people again were quite wary of her because she was this new person with a strong British accent who had suddenly come to the school. So those are some of the key memories. We always used to have the anatomy vivas in our library. We had a very small library which was filled with some good books, but for some reason they always ran the anatomy vivas in the library, and so you'd have to line up and then go in and sit opposite these very powerful surgeons who would be questioning you about your anatomy. And I think that the style of teaching was very, very different in those days, and you did sit up, pay attention and learn a lot from the people. You just can't teach that way these days. If you throw your hand out and point to a student and say, answer such and such, or where is the basal ganglion, the students will complain about you, because you're isolating them, or you're making them embarrassed in front of the group or whatever. But in those days you had to be on the ball and prepared to answer a question when it was fired at you, left, right or centre. And so you did really try to be on the ball and to think about the answers and not be scared of having that sort of approach from somebody. But we had quite a contrast amongst the staff too. We had other people who, like Andrea Mosley, who had just started as a new member of staff when I became a student, and Mark Avery was another one who was doing his teaching certificate, and he'd only just started as well. And Keith Furness, who had also come from Britain but had only been there a year or so before I started as a student, and they were all quite different personalities to the older members of staff in the school, and many of them loved to chat in the lunch hours when we were between classes, and you could get someone like Keith Furness or Andrea Mosley on a track, and you could sort of get them going sideways, and we'd talk for ages. Yes, they'd talk about all sorts of things. Often they were physiotherapy related, but often it would be the experiences that they'd had, and so you built up quite a good rapport. Still the sort of student-teacher relationship, but it was interesting that they were prepared to chat and would often talk about their experiences. I remember Keith had been sent to Malaysia to work in the army, and then he'd come back to Britain and was put in a pool, I think, to do physiotherapy, and probably wouldn't have been his choice if he'd ever really known. But I believe that he was almost illiterate as a child, had a very poor educational background, and yet managed to get through his physiotherapy, and then later on he actually got a PhD in history of art. So I think that if he'd had a different life, he probably may never have ended up in physiotherapy, but he's obviously a bright person. And so it was interesting to hear about those sorts of things in his life and where other people had been and worked. And again, I guess it was sort of the middle of an era in a way, in terms of we were moving on with the new modern staff like Andrew who was coming in, and yet we still had links with Robbie Powell and some of the others who were retired from the profession but were still quite strongly associated with it. So you would hear about people like Beryl Service and others who were still living in the city and were keen to still participate in physiotherapy in some way. So you sort of knew the people who were the old era and then got to know the younger staff as well.